Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting installment of Mayan's 2020 spring classes. We're very excited once again, to have Rachel Danziger teaching for us on a class called Exiting the Cave to help us prepare for Lag Baomer, which starts tomorrow night. And a quick happy Mother's Day to any mothers out there or anyone who has a mother or ever had a mother. It should continue to be a special day, so thank you for coming to learn Torah with us at Mayan today. Let me think, sorry. Everyone can hear me, right? Okay, good. We're just always happy to have Rachel with us. We are offering these classes for free over these weeks, but if anyone's interested, willing, able to help contribute, to help Mayan continue to offer free programming, we have a suggested donation for these classes of $10, or if you'd like to sponsor a class, we can find a level that works for you. I'll post a link to that on our website. And if at any point you want to make sure that you're on our mailing list, if you're new to Mayan, we're based in Boston. And we are a primarily women's Torah organization, fostering high-level and exciting shiurim for women and sometimes men. But we're very happy to have any men who will want to come to this class tonight to enjoy. And without further ado, Rachel, take it away. Oh, let me unmute.
Just a minute. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Ilana. Can everybody see me and hear me? Okay. I guess I have to rely on your nods since you are muted. It's lovely to see familiar names and faces and unfamiliar names and faces. Always a pleasure. And as Ilana said, at some point during the class, we're going to open it for discussion. For now, I'll speak a little, and then I'd like to hear your input. So today we're going to talk about Lag Baomer, and in Lag Baomer we kind of commemorate two events. We'll get to one of them later in the class, but we'll start with one of them, which is the death day, the Hilulah of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. There's the Talmud and the later Midrashic tradition is full of interesting, bizarre, mystical stories about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But by far the most famous one, the one that kids in kindergarten can usually remember the best at least, is the one about his form of extreme quarantine, so to speak, when he spent 12 years in a cave. And today we're going to really focus on this story, and we're going to dive into it and dig into it and open it from different angles and see what it's about, what's going on there, and also what can we take from it now as we are in our own little caves, somewhat less Spartan than his, as we will see in a minute, but yet in our own little enclosed and private spaces, and contemplating leaving them as the lockdown will ease, and in Israel has eased. So without further ado, let's start with the story directly in the Talmud. And at first, we're just going to read about what leads Rabbi Shimon into the cave, and then what the life in the cave is like. And what I'd like you to pay attention to as we read the text is, in what way is the life in the cave different than the life Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had before the cave, as described in the story? So the story begins in Masechet Shabbat in the Bavli. Somewhat cutely, it begins in Daf Lamed Gimel 33, the same as Lag Baomer, the 33rd day of the Omer. And it starts with a question that has to do with a previous discussion where somebody said that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Elai is always the first one to speak. And they ask, why is he called the head of the speakers? And they answer here in this, I'm going to read it in the English, but whoever wants to look at the Aramaic is welcome. I'm going to jump 4 lines in. The Gemara relates that this resulted due to an incident that took place when Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon, this is our hero, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, were sitting, and Yehuda, son of converts, sat beside them. Rabbi Yehuda, not son of converts, the main Rabbi Yehuda Bar Elai, opened and said, how pleasant are the actions of this nation. And here they're talking about the Roman Empire. They established marketplaces, established bridges, and established bathhouses. Rabbi Yosei was silent, and we'll talk about this silence as well. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai responded and said, everything that they established only for their own purposes. They established marketplaces to place prostitutes in them, bathhouses to pamper themselves, bridges to collect taxes from them, meaning from the people who passed them. Yehuda, son of converts, went and related their statements to his household, and they were heard by the monarchy, the Malchut, i.e. the Roman authorities in Israel, which was at the time a Roman province. They said, Yehuda, who elevated us, shall be elevated. And that's how he became the head of the speakers. Yosei, who remained silent, shall be exiled to Tzipori. And Shimon, who denounced us, the government, shall be killed. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar went and hid in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall. Can you imagine that? Imagine the Beit Midrash where people come and go and sit and study, and they're just hiding there. They're just living there, surrounded by the books, surrounded by the rabbis coming in and out, not going into the outside world. Every day, Rabbi Shimon's wife would bring them bread and a jug of water, and they would eat. When the decree intensified, i.e. the soldiers probably went looking for them, Rabbi Shimon said to his son, women are easily impressionable. Unless the authorities torture her and she reveals her whereabouts, meaning we should avoid that, they went and they hid in a cave. So before we dive into what happens when they get to the cave, let's talk a little bit about this, about the story that tells us how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai ended up living in a cave for 12 years. I'd like to ask you, and feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share. And I have to say, just a Zoom comment, I can't see all of you at once. I keep clicking through, so I'll see everybody, but it's I can't see all of you at the same time. So if you want to speak, just speak up. I can't always be able to. I'll try and moderate, but we'll figure it out as we go. I'd like to ask you, what can you tell me, just from this small midrashic story that we read now, about that world where Rabbi Shimon lives, normally, when he's not in a cave? I'll be more specific. What kind of relationships does he have? What kind of relationships are there in his life? Does anybody want to venture?
He has a domestic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, he wouldn't be mentioning the wife bringing food for him and the son, and his worry that she'll tell the Romans where they are.
Yeah. Do you think he's worried for her sake or for his sake? I'll explain myself. Do you think, and everybody's welcome to try and answer, is he worried that she'll give in because she's easily impressionable and the Romans will find him, or is he worried that they'll torture her to find out and she'll be hurt? Does anybody want to venture a guess?
I think he's more worried that his wife will give away his location than he is about her.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, is that Juliet? Who is it?
Yeah, it's me. It's Juliet.
Yeah. Okay.
It sounds like he's more worried about himself than her, but he realizes that, unfortunately, I mean, he says women are impressionable, but anybody might break under torture.
Mm-hmm.
Give away the information.
Mm-hmm. At this point, we don't know definitively, but that's the feeling that comes through it. What other relationships does he have?
It also sounds like an open secret between him and the other people in the Beit Midrash where he was hiding out, because his wife came every day to bring food, and I suspect that he wasn't like literally living in the closet there.
Yeah.
So, that was the other thing, that he probably had it's interesting that he's worried about the wife saying where he might be when there's probably 10, 20 other people who probably know where he is too.
Yeah, and to strengthen what you're saying, Susanna, Rashbi was not an inconspicuous kind of person. He was one of the most prominent students. I don't have corona. Sorry, I'm just coughing. Don't want to cause a panic. He was one of the most favorite students of Rabbi Akiva, a very vocal chacham who speaks every time that there's a convention of the rabbis in that era. He speaks up. Clearly, the people in Beit Midrash knew who he is. He wasn't like hiding there incognito. So you're right.
There's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How did the authorities find out about what he had said? I mean, someone was telling the authorities.
Mhm.
Well, the weak link, the way the story is written, is the household of the convert.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that it's not a case of the convert going to the authorities, which frankly is how I remembered the story. And then I realized when I revisited it that I had it wrong. It wasn't a malicious intent as much as it's loose lips sink ships kind of case. But that's another relationship. We see that he has those people in the Beit Midrash that we assume know who he is and assume don't tell the secret. We see that he has this relationship with Rabbi Yehuda ben Gerim, who speaks carelessly to people who apparently are not very careful in the way they guard secrets. What other relationship does he have?
With
His son.
his son.
Donna, thank you.
But his son seems kind of, from what we've read so far, seems sort of passive in the Gemara. He's not playing an active role yet.
I think that's a really interesting point because we'll get to it in the end. There's going to be the son, just like Rabbi Shimon is going to go through a character development arc, the son is going to go through his own character development arc. But I think you're right, that at this point he's almost more an extension of Rabbi Shimon. He's there with him because Rabbi Shimon kind of carried him with him.
Do we have any idea?
Sorry, who's speaking?
Do we have any idea how old the son is?
There's a lot of discussion about that, and in general about the Midrash. I'll put it this way. In the Midrashim, in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, the son of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rashbi, the character of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rashbi, some say that he was a kid, like young kid, like 13 or something like that. Some say he was already an adult. Some say that he was even younger than that. It's very hard to time this midrash. And in fact, the modern scholars overall agree that it's not an exact story, that it's not a story that reflects something that historically happened as it is told, but rather it's an agglomeration of events that did happen and were arranged in a certain way to teach a certain lesson. For example, one of the reasons they assume that is that Israel, where Rashbi lived, simply doesn't have these kinds of caves. As we will see the cave in a minute, it's like a nice, massive cave where he can live, and like there's tree and water in it. It's just not a very, it's not, I'll be more accurate. There are caves like that in Judea, in southern, like where Jerusalem is and all that. But in the era, it seems that the story is evolving in the era where the center moved to the Galil. So it's not so clear how we're supposed to place all of that. Maybe we could say that they're hiding back in Judea, even though the Romans have a much stronger presence there. We'll get a little bit more to the historical background later, but at this point, I'll just say that I can't give you a definitive answer to this question of the age of the sun.
He also has a relationship with the Romans.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, he knows that there are marketplaces. He knows that there are bathhouses. He knows that there are bridges. So he's involved with the life that's going on that the Romans have created there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's not, you're right, that he's not a hermit. Clearly he's been out and about. And it's actually interesting in terms of socioeconomical groups and how people lived at the time. In the time we're talking about, there are three types of dwelling places or city arrangement. There was krach, which were those big cities, like Tzipori was a krach, like Lod was a krach, like Caesarea was a krach, Tveria was a krach. Those were massive cities, and those often had massive Roman presence and had bathhouses and bridges and all those things. Most Jews didn't live in those. Most Jews lived in what was called Ir, which is confusing because in modern Hebrew it's city, but then it almost meant more like a large village of a few hundred families that's still very agricultural. And then they had kfar, which again in modern Hebrew is a word for village, but then it meant more like a hamlet, would you call it? Like a place with like 3 huts and some sheep. So a lot of people lived in those also. So for Rashbi to be able to talk about the roads and the bridges and the bathhouses, it's clear that he traveled around. He didn't spend his life in one of those little hamlets or even in one of the, what we would call village, what they called a city at the time. But who's the first people we see in the story that he has a relationship with? Let's go back to the text for a second. Who are the first people he is in a relationship with right here in the beginning of the story?
Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi.
Exactly. We see that they're sitting, and it's also clear that Rabbi Yehuda ben Gerim is not exactly part of the same group, because we hear Deyatvi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon. They sat, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, and Rabbi Shimon. So it's like they're put together. Vayatev Yehuda ben Gerim Gabayhu, and Rabbi Yehuda, son of converts, was sitting beside or behind them. But first and foremost, he's sitting there with his chavrutas, with the other big rabbis of the generation. We will delve later into who they are and what this conversation stands for and we'll decode it a little more. Let's just conclude for now that there's an awful lot of relationships. There's the chavrutas, there's the world he lives in, there's the family relationships, so there's other people in the Beit Midrash. Let me ask you another question. What kind of occupations do people have in this story so far? What kind of things do people do? I'm going to leave it open here.
I mean,
They're prostitutes and they're
right. People who run the bathhouses,
merchants.
People who run the bathhouses and prostitutes, yes.
tax collectors, the bridge collectors.
And
Tax
they're also the rabbis.
The rabbis.
And the governors, you know,
And the people who sell things in the marketplaces.
Correct. It's not just the people who work there, it's also the people who go there. The clients of the prostitutes, the people who cross the bridges and have to pay taxes. Right. And the rabbis who sit and discuss matters or learn matters. Let's see what changes when Rabbi Shimon goes into the cave. Let's look at the next source at box 2.
It's also Rabbi Yehuda, who's the son of the converts, who talks so positively about what the Romans have done.
So I'm sorry, it's confusing, but there's 2 Rabbi Yehudas here. The first Rabbi Yehuda is not the son of the converts, the one who talks positively about the Romans. That's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Elai. He was one of the leaders of the generation of rabbis after Rabbi Akiva. While he disagrees with Rashbi here, he's not the one who started the rumor about this conversation.
And is the second one a rabbi? It just doesn't refer to him with a title.
He's
The
not
one, the son
referred
of
to as a title here.
converts.
We know from other places in the Bavli and in the Yerushalmi that he was a student of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He and a few other people appear constantly in the chavura, in the group that follows Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai around and learns from him. It seems that he never made it to the level of becoming a rabbi. I'll give you a spoiler already. According to this story, this version of the story, there's other versions of the story in Yerushalmi. According to the Bavli story, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai kills him at the end. So I guess he never really made it to the point of being ordained as a rabbi proper. But he was a student of the rabbis. He's not a random passersby.
So is Yehuda a Roman? His family are Romans?
I don't know. It could be that there is an answer to that, and I apologize. I don't know the answer to this. I didn't find one, at any rate.
But we don't know what city this is taking place in.
No, this is kind of neutral. It starts somewhere. But later, as we go to the second part of the class, when we kind of step back from the story, the condensed story, and try and understand how to place it in a wider context, and we'll get back to this question. Remind me then. Let's delve into the cave. Let's see what happens when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai decides that his wife either shouldn't or couldn't be trusted, or he doesn't want to get her tortured. Not so clear. and decides to go into the cave. A miracle occurred here. I'm at source 2. A miracle occurred, and a carob tree was created for them, as well as a spring of water. They would remove their clothes and sit covered in sand up to their necks. They would study Torah all day in that manner. At the time of prayer, they would dress, cover themselves, and pray, and they would again remove their clothes afterwards so that they would not become tattered. They sat in the cave for 12 years. Eliyahu, the prophet, came and stood at the entrance to the cave and said, "Who will inform Bar Yochai that the emperor died and that his decree had been abrogated?" What relationships exist inside the cave? We saw the wife, the son, the friends, the chavrutas, the random people around who are part of society before. What is the sole relationship that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has? Or yes, Andrea.
It's him and his son, and there's so few relationships that they need Eliyahu the prophet to come give them news.
Just a moment, sorry. Can everybody who's not speaking now mute themselves because there's a echo? So Andrea said, thank you, Andrea. Andrea said that that the only relationship is him and his son, to the point that they don't have any way to get information about the outside world. And you're pointing out something very important, which is not that only that there's only one, not only that there's only one relationship, but also that there's a very real isolation here. There's a real clear line between the inside world of the cave and what they know and do inside it, and the outside world. And they need a prophetic intervention, a miraculous intervention to get something from the outside world in. So so we have these two men who are in a relationship with themselves, and what do they do? What
they
kind
also
of
have a relationship with
exist within the cave?
What was the question again?
What kind of occupations or activities take place within the cave?
It's a horrendous description of being buried in sand up to your neck in order to study Torah, in the explanation of sparing their clothes because it indicates further isolation. Unlike in the Bet Midrash, here neither the wife nor anybody from the community came to provide them with anything, whether human contact or concrete supplies. So this is very, very, very isolating.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing out to something important, which is God himself provided them with supply of their basic needs, right? The food and the drink, but nothing else beyond that can come from the outside. So they have to be very careful to preserve their clothes. I just want to say, Andrea pointed out in the chat that they're going back to the relationship question, that the relationship between father and son is also a relationship between student and teacher and between two chavrutot, which is very interesting. It's very economical. Have two people and have them be everything to each other, basically. A lot of the things we saw before.
And also two exiles, so to speak.
Yeah, two exiles, yes. Okay. Do you think, it sounds to me, Chaya, from what you're saying, that to you this description evokes unpleasant associations, that it's like they're burying themselves, they're miserable there, or not miserable, but they're exiles there.
I'm not sure that they're miserable. I mean, I'm not sure that this necessarily leads to misery. It can bring enlightenment, it can bring transcendence in terms of how you think and how you feel. A lot depends on the personality, and we don't get a hint as to what their personalities are, what impact it has on them.
At this point, we'll see how it evolves later. Thank you, Chaya. Janet, you wanted to say something? Janet Zimmerman?
Yes. Well, it makes our quarantine look good compared to what they were into. And yeah, they're isolated, they're socially isolated, but they're completely connected to Hashem. I mean, God is making miracles happen for them, you know, with the spring and the carob tree. And no doubt
the Torah study that's happening and the prayer that's happening, you might understand is all in this miraculous context. So it must be, and Eliyahu Hanavi is standing guarding over the mouth of the cave. I mean, they're living in a completely miraculous context.
Mm-hmm.
So seems pretty powerful.
I think it's a very good point, and I think it's important to take both your comment and Chaya's comment together and see that on the one hand it's extremely ascetic. They don't have access to a lot of things, but the things they do have are very special. They have this intense learning relationship. They have this family relationship. They have the very tangible presence of God. It's interesting for us because even in stories that are not miraculous stories, when you talk to people who were in isolation, in solitary confinement, in disaster areas where they were alone for a long time, a lot of people say that in this time they felt God's presence the most, or if they don't believe in God, they felt spiritual presence the most, in the sense that something about this kind of focused experience opens us to a feeling of dependence on the Almighty. And that's another point I want to delay on for a second, the point of dependence. Here, they're only dependent on God. Other than the clothes on their back, literally, they didn't bring anything except themselves into the cave. Everything else, water, food, and information comes from the outside, from God directly, in a sense. And that kind of highlights, I think, that before that, and the scenes leading up to that, there's an awful lot of dependence on other people. Would anyone like to comment on that or elaborate on that? What kind of people is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai dependent on before the cave?
He was dependent on his wife for the meals. He was dependent on his chavrusa for the learning and the interactions with the learning. And he probably was dependent on the Romans for the roads and the bathhouses and the marketplaces. And
Mm-hmm.
He lived in a community.
He was dependent on the people in the Beit Midrash not squealing on him being there.
True. Not just his wife, also the other people. And as Chaya said, he lived in a community, so presumably there were farmers who made his food. And we'll talk about Rabbi Shimon's attitude to farmers soon enough. We'll get to
did
that
he
part.
Feel like
Did
it
he
was
bring
a-
the Torah with him, or what did he bring with him to be learning and to be davening?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
What did he bring with him to be able to study Torah and to do the tefillot?
It doesn't seem, I mean, it could be that he brought some text with him, but it doesn't seem like he did. It seems like they were learning from the mind. At least that's what the image evokes to me, a sense of people learning from the mind, especially when you look at it in the context of the Talmud Bavli, where they talk about how to learn, and a lot of the rabbis emphasize that first you have to learn everything by heart, then you start delving into it and trying to understand what it is, especially since that obviously was before they had the written Mishnah. It's before the Mishnah was written. It's all about people remembering what their rabbis taught them and memorizing, and then starting to dig into it and try and understand the reasons behind it and how to make sense of it. I'm sorry, Chaya, were you trying to say something before?
I was just thinking that it's an integrated life that was intellectual, but also kind of corporal or practical. It did not look like he was an ascetic person in his normal life before the trip to the cave. And whether or not it was friendly interpersonal relationship or that he used to be a so-called big mouth and a defiant person, but it looked like he was connected enough.
Yeah, a lot of connections, as we said, and a lot of dependence. And then he lives in the cave and he's without that. And let's see what happens when he's asked to go back. Does anybody else want to add something before we move forward with the story? Okay, so let's move on and see what happens. Sorry, not working here. Here. See what happens when it's time for him to leave after Eliyahu made his comment. So at this point, we might still think that maybe it was a good thing good life for him in the cave. Maybe it was difficult and horrendous for him. But then comes this story and makes it pretty clear. They emerged, namely Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, emerged from the cave and saw people who were plowing and sowing. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, these people abandon eternal life, Chayei Olam, the eternal life, the life of forever, meaning learning Torah, and engage in Chayei Sha'ah, the life of an hour, temporal life. Every place that Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar directed their eyes was immediately burnt. They're literally reducing the world around them, the outside world that they now left to ashes. A divine voice emerged and said to them, did you emerge to destroy my world? Return to your cave. They again went and sat there for 12 months. They said, the judgment of the wicked in Gehenom, in hell, lasts for 12 months. Surely their sin was atoned in that time. A divine voice emerged and said to them, emerge from your cave. Tz'u mimaratchem. It's a strong statement. Tz'u mimaratchem. Come out of your cave. Very direct. They emerged. Everywhere that Rabbi Elazar would strike, Rabbi Shimon would heal. Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Elazar, my son, you and I suffice for the entire world as the two of us are engaged in the proper study of Torah. As the sun was setting on Shabbat Eve, they saw an elderly man who was holding 2 bundles of myrtle branches and running at twilight. They said to him, why do you have these? He said to them, in honor of Shabbat. They said to him, let one suffice. Why do you need 2? And he answered them, one is correspondent to Zachor, remember the Shabbat day, as it's stated in Exodus, and one is corresponding to observe, Shamor et HaShabbat, observe the Shabbat day, as stated in Deuteronomy. Rabbi Shimon said to his son, see how beloved the mitzvot are to Israel. Their minds were put at ease. Wow, that's kind of that escalated quickly, as my husband said last time we read the story. Before we try and analyze the right and wrong of the story and introduce moral categories and try and understand what they're doing wrong, what they're doing right, let's just go back to the basic questions we've been asking so far. We asked what characterizes the world of Rabbi Shimon before the cave and what characterized his world in the cave. Now we're given another glimpse through the world after the cave. We see that some people are engaged in agriculture. We see a community of people engaged in agriculture. I'll put it this way. I'm sorry, I'll take a step back. The story of the cave creates this very strong line, this invisible line between the in the cave and the out of the cave. Out of the cave, there's dependence on various people, there's various kinds of relationships, there's various kinds of occupations. In the cave, there's very focused relationships, very few occupations, all of which are focused on Torah study or davening, all of which are focused on our relationship with God, and very little dependence on anything outside of God himself. What does Rabbi Shimon see? What is so hard for him to accept when he goes out? What about the world outside grates on him, in your opinion, in your reading of it?
You know, Rabbi Shimon was living a life of total, not just aestheticism, but I mean, I'm not saying it correctly, pronouncing it, but he was totally separated and isolated, but he was totally relying on Hashem for his physical, material needs. Mm-hmm. And then going back into the real world, where everyone else was, he was shocked that they're not relying only on Hashem. They're, using their own hands to provide for themselves, and I think that was very hard for him to see.
It's interesting that you're putting the emphasis on reliance, Danielle. Does anybody else feel that the emphasis should be placed differently? For example, on the way they spend their time? I'm not saying you're wrong. I think it's a very interesting point. I want to capture all of it.
That's a very valid point. Right. His point was they're spending time in something that's very sha'ah, very temporary, it's not eternal, as opposed to what he was doing in the Ma'ara, which was eternal. Studying Torah is eternal, and these people are engaging in activities that are not eternal. They're very fleeting. Agriculture, especially something like agriculture, which is very fleeting, right?
And very dependent on temporal things, on the seasons, on famines, on all kinds of killer hornets, on all kinds of things that can come and mess up the schedule. But I think the point you made at first about how they're relying not on God but rather on something else is important, because I think it's implied in the story. When we see how independent on humans Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar were in the cave, it's kind of implied, it's in the back of our mind, it's almost in their subconscious. What he's talking about is they're wasting their time. They have time, they can pursue Torah, and here they're pursuing other things. But perhaps what he's feeling behind it is also this feeling of repulsion at needing to rely on physical things around you instead of having this direct connection with God. Yes, Janet, you wanted to say something? Janet Zimmer?
Naomi, oh.
I have to unmute myself, sorry. Their
I'll get to you, Susanna.
experience was very divorced from the world. So then when they go out in the world, it's like a shock that there's a world and the world has worldly things in it. And the first go round, they can't make sense of that. And I thought it was interesting in the second version, because there's two of them. One could have one, the old you, and the other has the new integrated vision. So I think there's another version, I don't know, that where they both, neither of them burns anybody down. Neither of them strikes. I don't know if that's true or not.
There's several versions. Let's leave that aside, but I think you're making fun. I'll get to you, Susanna, and then Andrea in a second. I just want to respond to Janet's point that I mentioned in the beginning that the son will have his own arc, right? That in the beginning, he's an extension of Rabbi Shimon. Here, all of a sudden, Rabbi Shimon gets it. After the first exit and the rebuke from God, he gets it. He gets that he's doing something wrong. The son is a harder time. Is it that perhaps the son spent more of his life in the cave than out of it? Surely seems like it. Imagine growing up in this existence. It's much harder to readjust than it is for Rabbi Shimon, who already had an entire life and career before. But it is interesting to see that suddenly these two people who look like an extension of each other, or one an extension of the other, suddenly have become interlocutors. They've become part of a conversation that's visible to us because they have a certain disagreement. Susanna, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think if you look back to the original conversation, there is, from the lechatchila, something very negative about Rabbi Shimon, because people are saying, you don't necessarily have to praise the Romans, but, there's a bridge. And what's his point about the bridge? It's not, oh, you can get over the river safely. It's, oh, they're going to give us, we're going to have to pay a tax. So whatever is put forth as sort of a mundane thing, he's like rejecting. He's saying, oh, marketplace, that's just, there's nothing happens in the marketplace in his eyes except, the prostitutes. So when he comes out of the cave the first time and the world still isn't his perfect, he's still, he's like more judgmental than God. And God has to tell him to hold on, you got to go learn a little more.
It's interesting because I think that it's something we can definitely see in our experience now, that this time, with all its pressure on us, this pandemic that puts us in pressure, that makes our life contract, a lot of people, I'm hearing from myself and also from a lot of other people who share their experiences with me, that it's almost as if we intensify. Whatever we're good at, we become better at it. Whatever was hard for us before is harder now, because there's a certain intensification. And it's almost as if the cave was this kind of intensification experience for Rabbi Shimon. Also, he didn't have to interact with all those things that bother him about the world, with all those prostitutes and Romans and whatnot. And he's no longer used to being in a position where, yeah, I don't like it, but it's there. Now he can't stand it anymore. He had some time in utopia. He can no longer stand the normal world. I think that's a very valid point. Thank you. Andrea, you wanted to say something?
Rachel, this is Amy. I wanted to say something that maybe relates the beginning story to this story. There are two instances. One is that it starts where it has something to do with the convert, and the other one I think about Shana Bet for the students who often go, to when they go to Israel for their gap year, and then they're supposed to come home and then continue with college and studies, and many times they'll come home and their parents aren't enough and they're not following the rules enough, not doing it right. They want to go back for Shana Bet to learn more in the rarefied atmosphere, get on with life in the regular world, because they're young and they're learning. And this could Rabbi Eliezer, the son, Elazar, the son, also that the same happens. I know all times when somebody is a convert to Judaism, especially, well, in Orthodoxy it takes many years, but in the strains it goes more quickly, and sometimes somebody converts because they're marrying somebody who's Jewish, and I've seen happens is it becomes more religiously observant than the person that they're marrying or that the family are going to, and they're saying, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? So it's sort of like, you're learn something that it's theoretical and it's in the academy, but it's not as practical as it should be. And the more that you're isolated from civilization, regular everyday day living, the easier it is to say, oh, well, we do it this way, we do it that way, but it's all theoretical. And then it becomes more difficult to fit back into the day world. And so in this story, it's not until afterwards when they ask the fellow, why do you have these two branches? Why two? And he says, the Zahor, that it's not just doing mundane things that aren't religious. It's his physical example of something that is theoretical, but he's doing something practical. It's not just hypothetical, it's real. And this, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, maybe, he had a life for the cave, and after he goes in for the year and he temper with the practical. The son had so much of the learning and the theoretical, he's not able to do it. And that may be going on.
That's very interesting. I think, first of all, I think many of us can attest to it either from personal experience or from people around us. Just saying, can I ask that everybody mute themselves? I hear echoes, so just make sure you are muted. Thank you very much. Andrea Kamens, I'll get to you in a second. Okay, thank you for your patience. I just want to comment here about the man with the branches at the end. We'll get to that more in a bit when we're going to talk about the right and the wrong in the situation. But I think you're making an important comment, Amy, that this is something physical that connects between the spirit and matter, because the man is experiencing his relationship with Shabbat through a physical thing that's related to the Torah, that's related to the ideas that Rabbi Shimon lives by. And I think it's interesting here that it also has to do with smell, because smell is a very potent sensory experience. It's known for evoking memories that have long been lost and that other senses can't quite bring back to us. It's something that really connects us to deep layer within ourselves. And I think it's kind of fitting that that's the thing that connects Torah and physical life for that man and brings peace to Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar. But before we continue, I would like to hear what Andrea has to say.
So, can you hear me actually?
Yes.
Connecting back to the comment that it all goes back to the original argument, I read part of it is not just being people weren't engaged in Torah, they were engaged in farming, but the original argument that happened, he spoke out against attributing good things to the material benefits people were getting from the Romans specifically by saying they were immoral or anti-Torah. Whereas other people were saying, yes, but we get these material benefits from them. And when he was able to exist with his son getting the material needs met directly by God with no compromise, and then came out of exile and clearly had been the only one to speak up. So it's almost as if these people were collaborators in his exile, not just, farmers, but people who kept on reaping the material benefits of the world that they had, and not standing up for Torah beyond not studying Torah.
I think you're introducing a very important and potent element to the conversation here, which is that it's not just about what they're doing. That it's not just about are they toiling in the field or studying Torah. It's also, if they still have a field to toil in, it means they didn't stand up against the Roman persecution. And we'll get to that very, very shortly, to the Roman story.
What did
the
they
Roman
have to compromise to be okay while he wasn't?
Yeah.
What did they have to be silent about?
I think that's I never thought of it before. Thank you. It's a really interesting personal grievance element to this story that I didn't think about before. I want to sum up for a minute, and so we can move on, and as I said, as I hinted just now, place it in the broader story of the Jewish people at the time. But first, we have to really try and understand what is the difference, or why God is so negative about Rabbi Shimon's response. Because it's very clear to understand why Rabbi Shimon, in a sense, prefers the life inside the cave to the light outside of it. We said that he's occupied only with things like Torah and Tefillah. He is constantly occupied with them. He doesn't have to be occupied with all the people who need things from him and want things from him and deal with Chayei Sha'ah, temporal life. He can really focus only on Chayei Olam, on the life of the eternal life of the Torah study. It's less messy, it's less complicated, and let's be frank, it's less dangerous. Another thing that the world outside contains that doesn't exist inside the cave is a threat of danger. It's a threat of violence. In the first part of the story, it comes from the Romans. The Romans are the threat in the background that means that life outside is unsafe. In the later part of the story, it comes from Rabbi Shimon himself. He is a threat to the people around him. But either way, life outside, because it's so messy, because it's full of people with different ideas and different agendas and different interests, has the sense of impending conflict and possible impending violence. Life in the cave is peaceful. You understand why someone would want that and would be disappointed to see the outside world not rise up to it. And yet God doesn't show sympathy. God doesn't say, I know, but tough, like, we have to compromise, you have to make peace with the world. That's not what God says. Let's look at God's words again. I think it's really bears repeating. God makes a very strong statement. He said, not himself, through a bat kol, a divine voice, did you emerge to destroy my world? Return to your cave. Note the inflection, my world, your cave. The world of the cave, idyllic, utopian, Torah-focused as it is not God's world. That's Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar's cave. That's her solipsistic utopia. Somehow, our relationship with the divine, our relationship with spirituality, and contrary to millennia of spiritualism that tells us that happens when we journal, or when we meditate, or when we isolate ourselves in a cave. No, our connection with Hashem, our coming in contact with God's world, happens out there in the place where there's danger, where there's relationships, where there's different occupations, where there are things that we disagree with or dislike, and where there's a threat of violence and conflict. That's where God's world is. And to try and understand why Rabbi Shimon has to come to terms with it, and why he can't just say, you know what, whatever, I'll just go back to my cave and live there. Why he still has to go through this process of kind of coming off his high horse and finding value in the way other people are doing things, we're going to have to go into the bigger context. But first, Chaya, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say that the life that seems to have lasted for 12 years in the cave, even though on the outside it looks like semi-torturous, it's very self-indulgent. You don't have to get mixed up. Your son doesn't like you, your son says something, you put a little more sand up his neck. And you discipline him this way. But the fact that the story chooses to use fire and destruction as the consequence of this intolerance on the part of Rabbi Shimon is indication that the subliminal transcendence is also not an answer for real life in the world that God created, because the whole farming enterprise cannot exist unless there is a higher power that arranges for the seasons and everything else. So they were not just greedy collaborators who failed to resist the Romans. They were also toiling from sunrise to sunset to provide for themselves and the community. It's just like what happens now, that you can't get eggs or you can't get chicken because of the slaughterhouses being contaminated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that part of the moral that I see is things have to be more well-rounded and balanced in order to really be effective and meaningful to all those who exist in the community.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that the life Rabbi Shimon led in the cave, I think, while perhaps idyllic for him, and I'll take a step further and say it is idyllic for him, because consistently Rabbi Shimon, here, let's go for a second, let's jump ahead. Rabbi Shimon consistently talks throughout the Talmud about how learning Torah is the face all, the one ultimate value that everything should give way to. For example, when all the other rabbis discuss why people get sick, and they come up with all kinds of answers, and they talk about a particular sickness, askara, which sometimes is translated as diphtheria, it's not so clear, they think that it's for slander, when people say lashon hara, and they have a whole discussion on that. Rabbi Shimon says no. He says here in this source in Shabbat 33a, he says, no, it's because of bitul Torah. When people don't study Torah, they get sick. In other places, there's a place where the Torah says, ve'asafta deganecha, and you shall gather your grain. And in other place in the Torah, it says, this Torah shall not depart from your mouth. And the question is, how are these things supposed to go together? If you're supposed to study Torah all the time, how are you supposed to also take care of your grain? So Rabbi Ishmael says, when you collect your grain, do it in a way that's in accordance with your learning, applying all the things you learn. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no. If you do all those agricultural work, there's no way you're going to learn Torah. But rather, when Israel are doing the desire of God, God will make sure that their job is done by others, kind of like him in the cave. And while people are not doing what God asks of them, then they're going to have to work and not have time for Torah. And Abaye has this dry editorial comment here at the end of this source. If you look down here, many have acted in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael, the one who said, no, do work, but do it in accordance to Torah, and were successful. And many have acted in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and were not successful. His opinion makes a cave perfect for him, but it also kind of withdraws responsibility for it means that he's not taking responsibility for the rest of the world. It's very self-centered in a sense. I'd say more than that, I like the word self-indulgent, even though I don't know that that's how we experienced it, but it's there's no sense of mutual, there's no sense of broader expression. He's getting higher and higher, but where is all this light going? It just remains between him and God and his son. I want to pause here for a second though. And there's a lot of things in the wide world that God created that we can say, oh, this is why God wants us to be in that world, because we have to be responsible for our community, because God made the world, so he must want us to live in there, etc. But I want to point out I want to narrow down to a particular aspect of the outside world that I think the story emphasizes and is important for us to consider. And for that, we have to go back to the beginning of the story again, to the first part. How does it all start? It starts when we see 3 rabbis sitting and disagreeing. Now, this disagreement is no idle disagreement about minutiae. They're talking about the Roman presence in Israel. And let's take a step back and ask, what are they even talking about? What is the Roman presence? They're the generation of rabbis after the failure of Bar Kokhba's rebellion in 135 after BC, no, AD, sorry. They're in a generation that watched the Romans come and clamp down and crush the Jewish settlements in Judea completely, execute all the spiritual and secular leaders of the generation. Bar Kokhba himself died in battle. Rabbi Akiva and other spiritual leaders were executed in a horrendous way. We still recall that in the text of Aseret Arugei Malchut that we read on Yom Kippur. Learning Torah was outlawed. Ordaining rabbis or judges, what's called smicha. Smicha at that time meant not only that you become a rabbi, but also it means that you can sit in judgment and fine people. And that's a big deal for running an orderly society. That was disallowed. In fact, the Roman law went as far as saying that if you did it, if you're a rabbi and you ordain somebody else, you will die. This person you ordained will die, and the whole city where it took place will be razed to the ground. The entire Jewish way of life and the Batei Midrash that were at its center and were the site, the arena of the continuity, were made illegal and crushed. The city of Jerusalem was declared Ilia Capitolina and made a closed area for Jews. Many Jews left Israel at that point, and many migrated to the Galilee. And now this entire generation of survivors has to try and scramble and survive. At first, it's all illegal. So particular rabbis risk themselves to ordain new rabbis so that the story can continue. We don't have time to delve into it, so I suggest look at the source sheet after the class. It's there. There's 2 stories about Rabbi Akiva before he was killed and Rabbi Yehuda bar Bava, who go and ordain the same 5 students. And scholars are trying to explain how can it be that 2 rabbis ordained them. Some say that maybe Rabbi Akiva ordained them at first and then Rabbi Yehuda bar Bava made it official. There's all kinds of attempts to explain it. We're not going to go into it right now. But when you read the stories, you can see the desperation, the sacrifice, the sense that you have to do it illegally, knowing that you might die. Especially in the story of Rabbi Yehuda bar Bava, he does it in a place between cities so that no city will be razed to the ground on his account. And they nominate 5 students who are now supposed to somehow restart the process and rebuild this world. Amongst these students are Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai, and Rabbi Yosei, the 3 students that are sitting there in the beginning disagreeing about Rome. And the time when they're having this conversation, it seems, is already when most of what's called the Shmad laws were relieved. They were already allowed to learn Torah, but they're still very much under the Roman boot and very much need to depend on the goodwill of the Roman authorities to continue doing what they're doing. And at this moment, when we understand this context and we see them sitting there and talking about Rome, it's no longer just, 3 people talking about how taxes are annoying or not annoying, whether their tax money is used for good things or bad things. It's 3 people talking about the empire that killed their rabbis, endangered their entire generation, that they have to continue surviving under and somehow not incur its wrath, as Rabbi Shimon immediately does. Sorry. And they have to make sense of how to live in this world. So this is a massive disagreement. Their conversation, it's not like, oh, let's talk about the weather. This is a core issue. Furthermore, as Rav Ben Ilau shows in his book about the Chachamim, in the 3rd volume about the sages, their opinions, the 3 positions that are expressed in the argument in the beginning, are typical of the rabbis involved and represent how they thought it's best to continue after the Roman persecution ended in a world that they're trying to rebuild. Let's look at the source sheet very briefly. We don't have time to really look in detail, but Rabbi Yehuda, who says, look how good are the actions of this nation, was first and foremost a pragmatist. He was a man who looked for practical solutions for problems. He was from a city called Usha, to which many of Rabbi Akiva's students, the survivors, those bedraggled survivors who somehow weren't killed and on whose shoulders it's now laid to create a new Torah center, came to Rabbi Yehuda's city of Usha in the Galil, and he welcomed them and established a new center there for Torah learning. In order to do that, he had to have amicable or at least diplomatic relationship with the Romans. Furthermore, he was a man who, in contrast to the entire school of students that came more from Rabbi Akiva, thought that the more important thing is not what you mean to do, but rather what you actually do. I'll give you an example. There's a question, if a man was walking near a city when Shabbat entered, and he doesn't know that he's near a city, so he says, okay, I'm dwelling here. He's allowed to walk 2,000 amma in each direction. But then if he realizes he's near a city, perhaps he can count on the eruv of the city, right? So Rabbi Akiva says, no. And Rabbi Meir and Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, all this school of thought, the students that came more from the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, say, no. What matters is what he had in mind before Shabbat entered. What Rabbi Yehuda Bar Elai says, no. What matters is what is. If he happened to be near the city and in a place where it's allowed to walk from there to the city, then he can count on the eruv in the city. I think that kind of sheds a different light on the conversation in the beginning when Rabbi Yehuda says, look how nice, how pleasant, how pretty the actions of this nation is. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, they intend ill. What these actions are, they're ill-intended for us. We understand that it's a deeper disagreement. Rabbi Yehuda says, judge things for what they are, not for what they're supposed to be, what the intentions behind them. Rabbi Shimon constantly wants to focus on what's the intention, what's at the heart of the action. So we said Rabbi Yehuda is a pragmatist, is a man who's looking for compromise, a man who has to maintain diplomatic relationships with the Romans. He's also a man who's willing to kind of be flexible when needs call for it. There's this horrifying story in Masechet Nedarim about a man who didn't like, I guess, his wife's food and said, I swear that you will not be allowed to enjoy me, meaning I won't support you, until you feed Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda from your food. I guess he wanted them to comment about how bad it is or something like that. And Rabbi Yehuda said, look, God is willing to let his name be erased to create the water that the woman, the sotah, drinks, the woman whose husband blames for betraying him. She's supposed to drink this water, and we put into it a piece of paper where we wrote God's name. So God is willing to allow himself to be disrespected, in a sense, to save this woman, perhaps, in case she's innocent. Of course, I'm going to do this thing that's not really mat'im. It's not really appropriate to say to a rabbi, come and eat this woman's food because her husband made this crazy oath, but I'll do it to spare this woman. Rabbi Shimon said, no. He said, let all the children of the widow die, and Shimon will not budge from his place. And furthermore, there is another reason for my refusal, so that they should not become used to taking vows. In other words, the principle of it for him is important enough that he's willing to not compromise and not give succor to this poor woman. So we see Rabbi Yehuda on the one hand, who's a pragmatist, works with the Romans, who's focused on de facto what's going on, and de facto there's bridges, there's markets, life can go on. Let's keep what we have, create stability, and teach Torah within it. And we have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says, no, we always have to reach the truth, and that's the most important thing. And there's the real truth and real justice. And the world can burn, but I will reach the real justice. And in the middle, we have Rabbi Yosei, who's silent. And one might think that silence says nothing, but the truth is that this is very characteristic of Rabbi Yosei, who's extremely diplomatic. Rabbi Yosei lived in Sipori, which was a mixed city of Jews and Romans of high society. Both the Jews and the Romans were very rich there. So he constantly walked through the kind of salons of the rich Roman ladies, and the Gemara has many conversations he has with them in which he explains Judaism to them and argues theology with the matronita, the madame, the Roman lady. But at the same time, he's working with these Jews who are not very learned, very rich, very self-important, very convinced that they know what's best, and very exposed to Roman way of life. And he has to kind of keep them in the fold without alienating them and pushing them towards the temptations all around them. So he's constantly willing to compromise and be silent when necessary, withdraw himself from the center of the conversation. So we see these three rabbis in this one particular conversation about Rome, and we see the indications or the kind of resonance of their different attitudes to what's the right way to survive in the world after the destruction that followed the Bar Kokhba rebellion. I want to remind you that the other reason we have Lag Baomer, it's not just the death day of Rashbi, it's also the day where we say the plague that killed the students of Rabbi Akiva ended. Many scholars say that this plague is really another laundered term to describe Bar Kokhba's rebellion. That it wasn't a plague, it was that they fought in the war and they were all killed. But whether they died in a plague or in a war, and those things often come together in times of bodies not being buried properly. Again, we're convening and having this conversation on the day when we're about to remember the devastation that these rabbis have to somehow work with. And yet the most remarkable thing to me in this conversation is not that they have different attitudes as to how to move forward, be at peace with the Romans, oppose the Romans, be diplomatic about it, find compromises, whatever. That's not remarkable to me. Anybody who ever met any Jews knows that they have different opinions about things. The remarkable thing is that they're having this conversation and there's no sense at any point that they're trying to prove each other wrong. They're just expressing their views. And the violence doesn't come from within them. They're not starting to attack each other or call each other's names or say, no, you got it all wrong. This is just going to lead to our destruction. You're collaborating, or you're so focused on principles that you're going to cause us all to be ruined by Rome again, or all those many accusations that they could have made to each other with a lot of good arguments behind them. They don't. The violence comes from the outside. The violence becomes because somebody talked to the Romans and the Romans bring violence into the picture. But those people disagree without violence. It's not so surprising when you read it in the context of the Talmud, which is all conversation upon conversation of rabbis disagreeing with each other and keeping their disagreements. They're not convincing each other. They're explaining why their opinion can withstand the criticism of the other opinion, but more often than not, the Gemara doesn't actually lead us to a hachra'ah, to a decision, this is right and this is wrong. But rather, through the back and forth, each opinion becomes clearer and more elaborate and more refined. Or as, sorry, just a moment. Or as Mark Alain Waknin says in a book about the Talmud called The Burnt Book, Machloket is a central, Machloket is the language of the Talmud. And Machloket, by definition, doesn't try to reach a resolution. It doesn't try to reach to a point of everything is okay, everything is set, we know what's right, we know what's wrong, but rather it forces every person to clarify their own opinion better, to understand it better, to examine it from different directions. And it kind of pushes us constantly not to seek one unifying truth, but rather to challenge our own assumptions. He compares it, we don't have time to really read over it, but I recommend looking at it later. He compares it to the Platonic dialogues, which are really one man writing two opinions with the intention to make us understand that only one of these opinions is correct. So the other opinion is always a foil to the truth that usually Socrates promotes. But in the end, the idea is that we're supposed to reach one understanding. The dialogue in the Talmud, we're not supposed to reach one understanding. We're supposed to constantly feel like we're losing our footing, and we have to keep asking questions and keep delving and keep looking. This is the world that Rabbi Shimon lived in before the cave. And it's only in this world, God tells him at the end, that God can be met. Because in our own narrow world, where all we have is our own opinion and our own truth, we're losing that. We're losing what happens when different opinions challenge each other and attack each other and force us to learn something from each other. Or as the rabbis and the Maharal Miprag says, there's a famous saying, o chavruta o mituta. Give me either chavruta or death. Either that relationship of arguing through things in the Beit Midrash or death. And the Maharal Miprag is a beautiful drush in it. He says that when we don't have chavruta, when we're just thinking about things in our own mind, then we're no longer thinking, because we reach some answer and we stop challenging it. We just accept it. So our mind is dying. The actual thinking process, the actual looking for truth process is dead. And that's the dead of our ability to meet God. God isn't in one truth. God is in the interaction of all those different truths. I know we're late. I'll just take another minute. I would say more than that. I would say that for us to survive the Roman persecution, we needed all those different approaches. Rabbi Yossei's approach was good for keeping the rich Jews in the fold. Rabbi Yehuda's approach was good for keeping the Romans from intervening too closely in what was happening in the new center in Usha, and thus allowing them to ordain new teachers and create a new generations of scholars. Rabbi Shimon's approach was good for keeping things real, for like not becoming too complacent and too, how to put it, and discarding our faith slowly. He kept things alive, he kept things real, he kind of constantly kept the pot boiling and kept reminding everybody of the value of Talmud Torah. So would we have survived if we only had one of those approaches? Who knows? What if is kind of a futile endeavor, but it's definitely clear that they all contributed, not only to Torah study, to like the truth that comes from Machloket, but also to the survival of the Jewish people after the destruction of Rabbi Akiva's generation. So we see Rabbi Shimon in the cave being cut away from that, being cut away from the mess, from dependence, from a lot of things that seemingly bothered him, but also from that interaction with which the story starts. And beautifully, the moment when he kind of comes back, the moment when he becomes part of it again, is a moment where instead of attacking the man with the myrtles, he asks him, why do you carry it and why do you carry it too? And asking means that you're part of a conversation again. Asking means that instead of jumping to conclusions, instead of thinking you know the truth and everybody else you'll either reduce to ashes if you have laser eyes, or reduce by just assuming that they know nothing, or reductio ad absurdum in your own mind in our less miraculous cases. When you ask a question, what do you mean? What are you doing? You're opening the door to the possibility that they're going to surprise you, that there's some truth that can be born from this encounter. And this is what I want to take from Rabbi Shimon's exit from the Mara. I feel that as we are contemplating exit strategies from our reality now, we disagree about what's the right way to go about it. And I guess that for me, as I'm facing these disagreements and the justified anger that a lot of people are feeling towards each other in this time of people paying different costs for more lockdown and for less lockdown, and dangers and risks and the need to balance it all. And in this conversation that's happening right now, what I want to take from Rabbi Shimon's experience of leaving the cave is two things. One, to kind of restrain the urge to jump to conclusions and to assume I know what people mean, but rather to pause and ask them, like Rabbi Shimon did, and know that they might surprise me. And also to remember that in our tradition, it's possible for three men with profoundly different philosophical approaches and personal styles and values, priorities, to sit and have a real disagreement and do it together. And my hope for all of us is that we can do it as well. Does anybody want to comment, ask, suggest?
יישר כוחך.
תודה רבה.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you everyone for coming. I
Thank you.
just sent in the chat that these classes are free, but we are, if anyone wishes to make a donation of $10 for this class or any amount, there's links to our website, www.mayan.org. Or if you would like to arrange to sponsor one of our future shiurim, you can email me at director@mayan.org. Just quickly, we're going to be some upcoming programming. We're working on a program next week with hopefully with Yoetzet Halacha Sarah Chessis. Those details will be forthcoming soon. And then also the week of on Tuesday, May 26th, getting ready for Shavuot with Rachel Slutsky. Her class will be called A Law for the Gentiles, the Noahide Laws, Their Origins and Their Functions. So save the date. There'll be information on our website also soon. So we hope you will join us for one or more of these classes, and we will continue to be offering them. And if you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see, feel free to email me again, director@mayan.org. Thank you again, Rachel, for such a wonderful class, and wishing everyone a happy Lag Baomer.